And good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. For those who I haven't met, I'm Amy Dempster, the Marketing and Communications Director at Carroll School. We're so glad that you've taken the time today to join us for today's conversation about Orton-Gillingham and Carroll School's approach to teaching students with dyslexia. Before we begin, I have a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, today's webinar is being recorded. We'll share the recording link in our Summer at Carroll weekly email, so you'll be able to revisit that presentation or share it with anyone who isn't able to join us live. Second, you'll notice that the chat feature is turned off. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen on the toolbar. We'll save time at the end to answer as many questions as we can. If we're not able to get to yours during today's session, we'll be sure to follow up with you afterward. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Heather Lufkin, who is the director of the Garside Institute for Teacher Training at Carroll School. Heather is an Orton-Gillingham Fellow, which is the highest level of certification in the Orton-Gillingham approach. The Orton-Gillingham approach is widely recognized as the gold standard for teaching reading, writing, and spelling to students with dyslexia. And as an OG Fellow, Heather is not only an expert practitioner, but is also qualified to train, supervise, and mentor educators as they pursue their own Orton-Gillingham certifications. Today, Heather is going to share an overview of the Orton-Gillingham approach, explain what it means, what makes it so effective for our dyslexic learners, and offer insights into how Carroll School brings these principles into the classroom every day. Heather, thank you for being here with us. We're so excited to hear from you. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amy. I really appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. We're excited to have you and thrilled to talk about Orton-Gillingham here at the Carroll School. As Amy said, I'm happy to answer questions at the end, and if we do not get to your questions, we can follow up after. Our goals and objectives for this presentation are to give a brief background on the Orton-Gillingham approach. We're then going to ground ourselves in the Orton-Gillingham principles and look at the Orton-Gillingham lesson at a glance. I would like to note that most of these samples are from grades 1 through 5 because I am primarily housed at the lower school, but we're happy to share middle school and upper school samples if that is something you're interested in. We're going to start with one of my favorite quotes because I think it centers all of us and it names what draws us together on this webinar. And what draws us together is dyslexia, a language-based learning difference. So the differences are personal. And so this is really something we want to recognize at Carroll, that there is a wide spectrum for dyslexia. The diagnosis is clinical. We understand that it has been a journey to be identified as having a learning-based difference. And the understanding is scientific, meaning that dyslexia is neurobiological. But the piece that we're going to talk a lot about today, and we want to highlight, is that the treatment, the way in which we address these language-based learning differences is educational. And that does happen here at Carroll in the Orton-Gillingham classes and the LFA classes and all of the classes. But again, our focus will be on the educational aspects of Orton-Gillingham. So we're going to go backwards to go forwards. As Amy mentioned, Orton-Gillingham is the gold standard for phonics-based instruction. So we often want to ask ourselves, who is this Orton and Gillingham? And so Dr. Orton was a neuropsychologist who actually started here in Boston and was studying individuals who had had strokes. He moved out to Iowa, and while he was in Iowa, he became very interested in running a mobile clinic. And a group of children was brought to him by teachers who were extremely bright, but they were all having difficulty learning to read. And the teachers could not really kind of puzzle out why this was happening. Dr. Orton became very interested in this and began to study these children and developed a hypothesis that it actually was not a visual problem, but actually had to do with the brain and the aspects of the language system in our brain, which involve listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And his theory was that the left hemisphere of the brain was not working as effectively. And this is amazing when you think that it was in the 1930s, way before we had functional MRI machines. He was one of the first people to term the phrase strophosymbolia, which I always say is a mouthful, but it means twisted symbols. He came back to New York, and when he journeyed back to New York, he met Anna Gillingham and Bessie Stillman. And Anna Gillingham is the one in the glasses in this photo. They were actually in Hawaii training teachers. And Anna Gillingham had been an educator and a school psychologist and a principal. Bessie Stillman, her close colleague, was a veteran educator. They became very interested in this theory that Dr. Orton had, that children who were struggling to learn to read, it really had to do with kind of the phonics approach and part of the brain. So they began working with him and actually analyzing the English language and observing with their own students what did and did not work. So these two women, on the floor of their apartment, started sorting all of the words that they could come out with from simple to complex, and worked with Dr. Orton to develop these 8 key principles that we will talk about. Their work continues, and it is referred to as Orton-Gillingham. And as Amy said, it's the gold standard for training and instruction. So I'm going to give everyone a minute to read this, and then I'll pull out some of the key features. So we are fortunate to be accredited both as a training site and as a school by the Orton-Gillingham Academy of Practitioners and Educators. And this is a statement by them from 2012. And what it says is that Orton-Gillingham is an instructional approach. It is designed for individuals who have difficulty with reading, spelling, and writing. I would also add in fluency, often associated with dyslexia. It's properly understood and practiced as an approach. It's not a method, a program, system, or technique. So said another way, when you are an excellent Orton-Gillingham practitioner, you have learned Orton-Gillingham so in depth that you are not handed a manual. You are going to write each lesson per child. And the depth of the training in terms of the academic hours and the practicum are intense. And people often ask, well, what's the difference between Wilson and Orton-Gillingham? This is a prime place to say it. Barbara Wilson was an Orton-Gillingham fellow. She's an amazing human. But Wilson was designed for groups, but more so really as a curriculum. If you're trained in Wilson, there is a curriculum. You're handed all of the lessons and the words that the students will read. Orton-Gillingham instead is this instructional approach. And when it's put in the hands of a well-trained and experienced practitioner, it's going to be individualized for each student, from the interests of the student to the level of decoding. So we always refer to it as an approach and not a program. So here at Carroll, we're very fortunate that the principles of Orton-Gillingham guide not only our work in our focus areas, but also in all of our classes. It's research-based. It's great for teaching reading and spelling, but it's also really wonderful for teaching and engaging in humanities and science and even bounders. And we're happy to discuss that at another point in time. But what I would emphasize is that everyone who teaches here at Carroll does get some training and exposure to this. Even if you're a bounders teacher, you've done some coursework. And so they are integrating prescriptive and diagnostic instruction into them, and they're integrating multisensory instruction. We're going to look now at the main principles which Dr. Orton and Anna Gillingham and Bessie Stillman worked to create. They have been updated over the years, but their core remains true. They are alphabetic and phonetic, direct and explicit, diagnostic and prescriptive, multisensory, which stands for visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile. It's structured, sequential, and systematic. We often say the simple to the complex. And it's cumulative and repetitive, going from the known to the unknown. It's individualized, which we were just discussing, cognitive, and emotionally sound and flexible. So now we're going to take a look at each of these principles and talk about how they are integrated into an Orton-Gillingham lesson. One of the biggest pieces that's essential for children with dyslexia, and actually all children beginning to learn to read, is to understand the phonetic structure of our language. Turns out 84% of the words follow either a phonetic or a morphological pattern. So we teach the structure of the English language in Orton-Gillingham. We begin with the simplest level, which is the sounds or the phonemes. You'll see those in those orange and white cards on the table. And that is linking this fancy thing called the alphabetic principle, which is the relationship of sounds and letters. And then what we teach students is we teach them the structure of words through the 6 syllable types and syllable division. So we're showing them the underlying sound symbol structure of our language and also the syllable type and syllable division structure of our language. Okay. Orton-Gillingham is also structured, sequential, and systematic, meaning that instruction is presented very systematically. We are clearly stating the concepts, we are modeling them, and we are practicing, and the student is practicing again and again. We are often moving from what we call supported practice to more independent practice. And we are staying with that to enhance their learning and memory so that we can lead to automaticity and independent application. What you can see here on the side at the top is a very simple sentence frame. And so we would start with the simplest, which would be how to create a sentence. We often use a program here called Project Read. And so the simplest is to work at the sentence level. And just like the sounds and the letters, we have to get really solid at a sentence level, research would say, before we get to a paragraph level. But you can see if you flow down over time and through a lot of practice, we will eventually get to the paragraph level. And there's a direct correlation between the two. One of the pieces that is essential for Orton-Gillingham, and I would say is a primary difference from Orton-Gillingham and Wilson, is that we are diagnostic and prescriptive. So every lesson is individualized for that student or students. The objective is woven through the entire lesson, meaning that students are getting multiple ways to practice this on both the decoding or the reading side and on the encoding/spelling side. I always explain this to trainees and families as if you were to go to the doctor and your knee hurts, and the doctor would ask you a series of questions. Have you been doing too many burpees? Have you not been walking enough? And they're asking questions to try to diagnose what's going on. And then the doctor would often prescribe a course of treatment. And that might be going to PT. It might be taking some ibuprofen. So every day, the Orton-Gillingham teachers here are being both diagnostic and prescriptive. They have this lesson, which has these individualized objectives and this differentiated instruction, and they're analyzing the work the student is doing and noting it on the lesson. And what they do is they then write the next day's lesson based off where the student is in the scope and sequence and based off of their errors and successes. And when they write the new lesson, they're prescribing a new course of action. So this amount of daily data is very helpful for us to monitor the progress of our students. And we always say in Orton-Gillingham, we go as fast as we can and as slow as we must. That is really kind of a big key differentiating factor. The other thing I'd note here is that we are using data to always inform our instruction. And so that does include the daily lesson plan data, but you'll also see noted on the slide, we are using the formal assessments. So if you have a student here at Carroll, you've graciously uploaded all of this wonderful testing. We, as practitioners here, do a full read of all that testing. We're then doing a full battery of informal assessments when they come in. So we can really use both the daily lessons and the formal and informal instruction and assessments to find the just right spot for these students to be working at. So Orton-Gillingham is direct and explicit. I always say there's in a sense no guessing in Orton-Gillingham. We're very clear with our students. They're very systematically taught. We show and explain and practice again and again. And the way we do that is we build off their prior knowledge and link it to the new knowledge. So what you can see here on the left is a way that we actually teach how you generally spell with CK or K. And the student already knows these sounds, but the teacher is very directly and explicitly leading the child to understand that when you hear k next to a short vowel in a one-syllable word, you generally spell it with CK. And all of our times, you would spell it with K. And the teacher and the student would do this together, and then there would be a lot of practice going forward. On the right, what you can see is those phonograms or those sound cards. The teacher has directly and explicitly taught that TH has two sounds, and th, and then they are reviewing them both with a keyword picture, but also in a word list. So the teacher is giving the student direct and explicit exposure to this content and sounds multiple times. And on the left of that student's hand, you're going to see a little sand tray so that when she gets stuck, which we'll talk about in a minute, there's a way for her to practice. Orton-Gillingham is cumulative and repetitive, meaning that it is really going from, as we said, the known to the unknown. So we're always spiraling back to what students know to move forward. We start with the simple and move on to the more complex. Because we're taking this data, there's a constant feedback loop. So what you will see kind of in this picture of one of our students in the past is that they were working on the sounds they knew that C made, which they knew that C made the K sounds. The teacher had gone back to that knowledge, which was solid. And the teacher was then going forward to the unknown and expanding the knowledge of, but when does C say S? And it turns out it says S mostly before E, I, or Y. So that's an example of going from the known to the unknown. Orton-Gillingham is cognitive. And what we mean by that is we are trying to engage the students to be strategic and to not guess. Kids really want to guess. They want to try to look at the first letter and give it a shot. But as I said, English turns out to be about 84% phonetic and morphological. So we can teach our kids patterns and spelling rules and generalizations. And if we build this reliable system to decode and encode, they can read thousands of words. So what you're going to see on the right is one of our students, and what she's learning how to do is to syllable divide. And what that means is she's learning how to take a word that has more than one syllable and break it into its syllables, and then identify the syllable types, and then identify the vowels. This is something we do all the time with our kids to help with longer multisyllabic words. And there is a set system, and we follow that set system every time. One of the most, I would say, enjoyable for the students and us as teachers components is that Orton-Gillingham is multisensory. And this is often another differentiating factor between Orton-Gillingham and other programs. So what you're going to see is we are always thinking about, we say the auditory pathway, which is hearing, the visual pathway, which is seeing, and the kinesthetic and tactile pathway, which is the touch. And we're trying to employ all three of those modalities in every part of the lesson. So what you're noticing here for this student is she had named her phonogram cards with those pictures above. Her teacher had those pictures to help unlock the sound of each of the letters. And when she needed some extra practice, she was using that sand tray at the left to give herself some tactile and auditory and visual feedback. This kind of repetition is especially helpful for our students because typically kids with dyslexia have a challenge in what we call phonological processing, which is the sound system of our language. So by adding in the visual and the kinesthetic, we're actually building more than one pathway for our students. And because we do it repetitively, that pathway in the brain is going to become highly myelinated, which means it's going to be connecting much faster. And you'll see another example on the left. B's and D's are a big challenge around here. And so we have a variety of ways that we help students. And sometimes it's as simple as a lovely mnemonic, which is the bat hits the ball, the line, and the circle. So our last principle we'll talk about is emotionally sound. Emotionally sound means that we are setting clear expectations with students. We are giving this systematic instruction with opportunities to practice. I always equate it to Goldilocks and the Three Bears. We're really working at that just right level for our students. You know, the chair is just right, the porridge is just right in Goldilocks, and in Orton-Gillingham, we're trying to monopolize on things that they are doing well and a little bit of an area that we're pushing and growing into. We focus a lot on internal motivation and giving them praise that has to do with the hard work they've done, because their increased effort will increase their self-esteem. We also try tremendously to connect with them on their interests. Tutors will write decodable texts that are very specific to their needs. They will read to their favorite soccer players. As anyone could probably guess, we have a lot of people reading to Messi and Mbappe right now. But that emotionally sound connection with clear expectations helps students to know that this person cares about them and is working to help them to be better at a task that is difficult. Okay, we are going to transition now into talking about the OG principles and a typical OG lesson here at Carroll School. What I want us to take a moment to look at is this wonderful quote by Margaret Bird Rawson. And she says, dyslexic students need a different approach to learning language from that employed in most classrooms. They need to be taught slowly and thoroughly the basic elements of their language, the sounds and the letters which represent them, and how to put these together and take them apart. They have to have lots of practice in having their writing hands, eyes, ears, and voices working together for the conscious organization and retention of their learning. So Margaret Bird Rawson is stating that in order for our children to be taught, we have to go as fast as we can and as slow as we must. We have to be looking at those basic elements of that language. That's that alphabetic and phonetic component we spoke about, and is also the component about moving from the simple to the complex. They have to learn how to put things together and take them apart. And that really does have to think about the diagnostic and the prescriptive, and lots of practice with their writing hands, eyes, ears, and voices speaks tremendously to the multisensory instruction we need. So on the left, what you're going to see is the Orton-Gillingham principles we just discussed. And on the right, you're going to see a typical Orton-Gillingham lesson. I will state that because we are individualized, we're always going to have a decoding and an encoding side, but there could be some differences based on the child. There is, however, a direct correlation between the principles and the Orton-Gillingham lesson. We're going to look at those and see them together. A typical structure of an Orton-Gillingham lesson is 50 minutes, and it starts with sounds, which is phonological awareness, and that's one of the primary challenges for our students. Then it's going to the grapheme or the letter sound, and that has to do with the alphabetic principle we discussed. Then we're moving into the word list, which has to do with the structure of our language, syllable types, syllable division. We then are working on fluency, and finally, reading. So again, we're moving from the smallest, which is the sound, to the most complex reading of passages. The encoding or the spelling side starts with what says, which is again sounds that they hear and then have to repeat back and name, spelling of words, and then spelling of sentences. So every day we begin our lesson with phonological awareness. It can look like this or be more complex. But what phonological awareness does is it helps our students to hear the sounds in our words. As I mentioned, dyslexia at its core typically has a challenge with phonological processing. So we're doing this every day because research says a little bit of phonological awareness every day increases their ability to hear and manipulate sounds. And teachers are using a multisensory approach where they're directly and explicitly giving students words, and students are moving these gems down and they're naming the sounds and they're talking about if the vowel's long or short. So it has that cognitive component to it too. And again, we're assessing where to start students with phonological awareness based on both the testing we have and our informal assessments. For some students, they then begin to move into what we call morphological awareness. And morphological awareness comes from the word morphology. And morphology is units of meaning. So we talked about English being 84% predictable, especially for spelling. That has to do with the phonemes, the sounds, and the morphemes. So we start working with kids actually very early on thinking about base words and suffixes, and not just how to break a word into base words and suffixes, but we're really working on them on what does suffix ed mean? Tell me about prefix pre. What does that mean? And by working on morphological awareness, we are also increasing not just their reading ability, but actually their vocabulary ability and their comprehension ability. We then move in the lesson into phonograms. And phonograms are the letter cards. I'm sure you've seen these and your kids have seen these. But what they're doing is they're linking that visual letter or that grapheme to a sound. We have a system here at Carroll where we would say A says ah as an apple, and the students are going through this every day. There's a review, and then there's new phonograms. And we're not just saying it, we're moving the card along. There's a keyword picture on the back. We're tracing it. We're sorting these cards. And all of these things are building a multisensory approach, cumulative or repetitive review. And they're building a speed that we need for our students to understand them. Typically, next, we are often very directly and explicitly either teaching something new or we're reviewing something. And again, we're often not saying to students, what do you think this is? What's your best guess? We're directly and explicitly stating it, and the students are practicing with us after we've often modeled. So we connect to what they know, which is that known. We link it to the unknown. And again, you're going to see there's an auditory and visual and kinesthetic component. So here, the student had sorted their phonograms into different groups, and they were actually reviewing with their teacher how to divide a word that had what we call a VCV pattern, when you have a vowel followed by one consonant and another vowel. And so the teacher was directly and explicitly stating that and using the cards to help the student to syllable divide. The next portion of our lesson is often referred to here at Carroll as words to read. And again, I've mentioned these are samples from the first through fifth graders. We have higher level samples if you'd like to see more morphology. These words are specifically chosen for each child based on their errors and also based on where they are in the scope and sequence. What you'll see here is there are some new words, and there are some review words. The words are the different day to day, but the patterns are the same. So what this teacher was doing was she was having the students circle the bees, which, as we talked about, can be challenging for our kiddos. And they were circling the bees and saying the sound. So we never just say circle the bees. We say, let's circle that and say that sound. So we're reinforcing that kinesthetic, that auditory by looking at it, visual by looking at it, and auditory by saying it. And then the student would read the list left to right, and they would often read the list multiple times to really develop some automaticity and fluency. This is done on paper, it's done with index cards, but the big idea here is that that objective is woven through the whole time, and students are engaged in the word reading. Next, we're working on fluency, and fluency really builds at the letter sound level, the word level, the phrase, and the sentence level. So often in this component of the lesson, we are working at the word level. You'll see on the right, there's a little one who has a mesh. They were learning that word for the first time. So the teacher was saying the word, the student was repeating, and they were tracing and naming the letters. That tactile feedback we often find very helpful for students to remember to read and spell the word. We're primarily in fluency working on non-phonetic words or fry words. And fry words are the 1,000 most common words in children's literature. But we don't just work at the single word level. We're also often working at a phrase or sentence level that is phonetically controlled so children can decode it. So it has kind of this cumulative and repetitive nature. That's the set of cards you see on a ring. We're often doing some of those based on just where that kid is. Every kid has a different set. And it has this multisensory component to it. The last part of the decoding or the reading side of the lesson is oral reading. And here at Carroll, we're pretty invested in 4 steps. We're primarily using phonetic books unless we've really determined a child is ready to kind of launch out of phonetic books. But the child is reading with the tutor. And not only are they reading out loud to the tutor, but then the tutor is modeling the text and the student is echoing and reading again. And the reason the model echo matters so much is because for many of our students, they develop fluency at the sound level, the word level, but when we get to the phrase and sentence and paragraph level, they can have a monotone response when they're reading. They can blow through punctuation. They cannot naturally phrase or chunk the sentences. So when a tutor or teacher models how the text should sound and the student repeats, we're giving them repeated exposure to the intonation, the rate, and the speed and accuracy. So this is a lovely time in the lesson. It's also a time, teachers are checking in a little bit about comprehension too and about what is happening. Okay. So we talked before about the lesson being 50 minutes and the first portion of the lesson being about decoding, moving from the smallest, which was just sounds, to the most complex, which was the book. Now we're going to talk about encoding, also called spelling, and we're again going to move from the simplest, which is the sounds, to the most complex. The Orton-Gillingham lesson mirrors each other. So on the front side of the lesson, we were asking them, tell me the sounds in bit, and they were saying b, it. And then we showed them phonograms, and they had to say B says b, as in bat. On this side of the lesson, every day, the tutor asked the student to repeat a sound and name the letter or the combination of letters that make that sound. This also does happen for morphology, and we will ask them what says un. We will also sometimes ask them, tell me all the prefixes that mean not. Eventually, they have to list 5. So what's happening here is the tutor says, what says b? And the student has to repeat the sound, retrieve the letter name, and then write that grapheme correctly on the paper. And if it is not written correctly, which does happen, we go back and we really correct it in a multisensory way. There's a couple of options that you can see right here. And then that tutor or teacher would take that error and weave it into the next day's lesson. And that really is what makes Orton-Gillingham diagnostic, prescriptive, and individualized. So we are not looking to move on until it is solid. So the simplest on the encoding is the sounds. The more complex is going to be spelling. Now, spelling is a very complex process that happens for many of us in our brain very quickly. What we use here at Carroll is called simultaneous oral spelling. What it means is the teacher says the word, they put it in a sentence, and they say the word again. They're using a sentence to give context or meaning, and then they throw the word, and the student catches the word and says it, and then they segment the word into the individual sounds. This part is essential because segmenting or blending are very challenging for our students, especially when we have to associate a letter. So if the word was bat, the student would catch it and say bat, and then they'd put up one finger each and say b-at. Then they would touch each finger and name the letter B-A-T, tell their pencil B-A-T, and read the whole word. What we're essentially doing with spelling is we're breaking this process down from the sound to the letter to the word level into very manageable chunks. And this is a system that works really well, whether you're spelling a simple one-syllable word like on the page or a multi-step word like predetermine. So the final part of our lesson, and again, the most complex on encoding, is called dictation. And dictation means that the teacher or tutor has written a few phonetically controlled sentences, again, individualized for this student. And the student is listening to the sentence twice, repeating it back, and then writing it. And when they write it at first, we actually we let them write it, and we as instructors are really looking and analyzing, okay, what is sticking and what is not sticking? What do I need to revisit again? And we use a proofreading strategy we call CAPS here for capitalization, appearance, punctuation, and spelling. And that's just not used in tutorial. It's actually used universally across all classes. For some of our kids, you're going to see up in the corner with the Pokemon, we need to use some tokens or some visuals to help them keep track of the words. If you have an older student, they might be doing tally marks, or they may not need that. That's the individualization that we often talk about here at Carroll. But looking at the sentence we have here, it was Pete gave a ride to Mike. And what I can tell as a practitioner is that, we're not solid yet on our VCEs. Maybe we were solid on spelling them in one syllable, single words for spelling, but when I put them in the context of a sentence, it's more tricky. So I, as a practitioner, would have more VCE practice the next day. So again, the most simple was the sounds, the more complex was the single words, and then the most complex is putting it into sentences. And as students progress through Orton-Gillingham, we work on dictating paragraphs. And the last comment I would make on this picture is, as I said, we always try to make it emotionally sound for our students and engage in their interests. So you can see in the corner both the Pokemon and the dog. And those were characters the student read to, but they were also a way that really helped the student to check their sentence. So I'm going to stop now and take questions, but I would like to note, if you have any additional questions, please email summer@carrollschool.org, and we'd be happy to get back to you.
Thank you, Heather. Every time Heather and I have worked on this presentation together for many years, and I swear I learned something new every single time. So I appreciate you sort of breaking down the OG approach. You talked about how tutors are diagnostic and prescriptive in their daily lessons. Can you share how outside testing is used, not just from an admissions perspective, but from for OG tutors and educators to, help inform levels and approach in the classroom?
Yes, I always say I used to be a special ed teacher in a public school for a long time. I was fortunate to come and train and work here at Carroll too. We are so fortunate here at Carroll to have what I lovingly call a treasure trove of data. And so if you have a student who's here in the academic year, or even in the summer, you've graciously shared so much information with us. One of the first things we really do from the head of language to the head of tutoring down to the individual teachers and tutors is we read all those files. And there is really something about that to sit and read the full file on a student. And we, offer professional development for our teachers and tutors here to understand more about both these assessments and the profile of our students. So we use the testing at the simplest form by reading it, and we use it to help inform classes and groupings. And then what we're also doing is we have a battery of informal assessments that directly relate, especially in OG, is what I can speak specifically about. Also occurs in language and math, but my specialty is OG. And there is this series of informal assessments that we are using 3 times a year. And so that is helping to guide where we're beginning our instruction in Orton-Gillingham, and it's guiding our progress over time. So the testing really tells us a lot about your student, and then we use our own to inform that more, because sometimes there's a delay on when the last bit of testing happened for your kiddo. And then our daily lessons that's also a big chunk of our data and assessments that we are using. So it gives us a starting point to summarize, it gives us a way to progress monitor, and it gives us a daily point of instruction as like a touchdown point.
Great. Thank you, Heather. I have a follow-up to that question. A parent asked, what happens when the child's test does not reflect their abilities because they're guessing?
Yes, that's a great question. So I always say I'm not a neuropsychologist. I am so amazed at people who are. What you always want to think about as a parent is that there are different components you want to evaluate your child on. And what I would say to parents about this, which is actually going to connect with home reading, is that when you first get a test back on your child and you see, for example, word reading or pseudo word reading, and that score can be, challenging to look at. And you think, but that doesn't reflect what they know. You have to look at kind of the components of the test and what was happening. I always say testing is a moment in time for kids, but over time there's a story. We often find always with our kids is that their decoding or their ability to read these words, especially in isolation, that does not correlate with their comprehension abilities. So the kind of the subtest I often say to families you want to look at if you really want to understand and see their strengths is actually the listening comprehension subtest. Because when you look at the reading comprehension subtest, they still have to read. We, know our kids have great comprehension strategies. Typically, they understand so much of the world, and our job is to teach the decoding and encoding so they can then access those tests, which leads me into the question we get a lot, which is, how do I support my kids at home? What do I do with my kids? So it might seem a little counterproductive because we want our kids to be independent and we want them to be learning as they go. But Marianne Wolf, who's a very famous reading researcher, would say, read out loud to your kids forever. Don't ever stop. So one of the things we would highly encourage you to do here is to read out loud to your students a book that is of interest to them. Oftentimes, our kiddos are not decoding at the level that they can comprehend. And we want to be building those comprehension and vocabulary strategies. So one of the best things you can do as a parent is to read a book out loud to them, be stopping every page or so and saying, so why do you think Harry wanted to open the Chamber of Secrets? And just not having to decode the words. They can follow along with you with their finger, but just the task of not having to decode the words is going to free up so much space in their brains to comprehend. So we always recommend reading out loud to your students, your children at home, or using Audible and having them track along. And if you need suggestions on phonetic book series, we're happy to give you some. Some kids do like to read one phonetic page to the parent and the parent reads the other. But I would highly encourage you to read a book that is above their decoding level, but at their comprehension level.
That's great. Thank you, Heather. So many great ideas. We have a question about students who specifically just come to summer at Carroll and what that looks like when they go back to their home district and it's all different. It's different approaches, might be Wilson, might be some other reading approach after having a summer intensive OG. Are the kids feeling confused, lost, and what could you speak to that?
Sure. So, as I mentioned before, Barbara Wilson is a Orton-Gillingham Fellow, and she created the Wilson system um, and program, right? So, there are many elements of the Wilson system that are very similar to Orton-Gillingham. The differences, as I mentioned before, are going to be that individualization. We also have I would say, a good chunk more of phonological awareness. Kids tend not to have that much difficulty going back and forth between. If it is something you're finding, I would encourage you to reach out to us. We tend to find in Wilson, we're all very familiar with Wilson, and many of us are trained in that too, is to switch a couple keywords, switch a couple ways we're explaining things. Because it's so individualized, we're able to do that easily. You will also get a report which you can share with your private tutors and your teachers, which will kind of detail where the student was. The tutors do leave at the end of the summer, but if you have more questions, you can always reach out to Summer at Carroll, and we will answer questions. And the last thing I would say, too, that is very helpful for parents is you will have a conference at the end of the summer, and the tutor will be explaining what they were doing for instruction and what was helping the student. So that's a third opportunity for you to really understand which methods or approaches are working for your own student.
Thanks, Heather. We have a question about actually the writing process of the physical writing. For middle school students specifically, is the recommendation to allow them to use audio to text tools, or should parents should be focusing on handwriting only? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm going to say, which is such like not an answer that you want to hear probably, but I'm going to say it depends. It would be hard for me to make that call without meeting or working with the student. What I will say is that we do use Chromebooks and all sorts of other kind of features to help our students, especially at the middle school level. There is a fair amount of research that would tell you that the speed at which you can manually write and the speed at which you understand those spelling systems, which when we were looking at that CKK or syllable type or syllable division, you want to think about written expression as having kind of a manual component, the physical component of writing the letters, and also the manual component of knowing how to spell those words. Written expression is really tricky because it involves a manual component, but it also involves a considerable amount of executive functioning where you have to understand your idea, you have to elaborate it, and you have to organize it, into a topic sentence and details and conclusion. And so in that case with written expression, especially in OG, we're trying to get that kind of manual piece up really well. We are teaching nouns and verbs and synonyms and antonyms, and we're teaching some components of grammar that are essential. But I would encourage you to talk to whoever the tutor or tutors to talk to the tutor supervisor, because they could speak very specifically about your students. For some students, as I said, we move away from the manuscript writing and into the voice to text because they just have such great ideas, and the manuscript piece of it is holding them back. And for other students, it's a different story. But we'd be happy to talk to you more specifically about your child, one of the tutor supervisors.
Thank you, Heather. That's, the individualized approach of the Carroll approach is what is so unique and special about what we do here every day, is that every kid has a different sort of like need. And even, in classrooms, a history classroom might sort of
Mm-hmm.
lean more heavily on the audio to text tools because they're working on content building and
Mm-hmm.
knowledge base. And, when they're in the writing specific ELA class, they're working on handwriting and
Mm-hmm.
getting it down. So it is such a multi-tiered answer
Yeah.
in question. So thank you. We've gotten to all of our questions today. We had one question from a parent that I think doesn't have a formal answer, but why are not all children taught to read in this way?
Oh.
And yes, I
So
think
it's such a great question. I always say, I don't want to give away my age too much, but um, I did start first teaching 1999, and so I always say I remember a world in which you know there was no structured literacy. So I feel so fortunate that we're here in Massachusetts. I know many districts have a long way to go, but thankfully, so much of the research that has been going on for well more than 30 years has been starting to make its way both into curriculums and thankfully into the legislation for Massachusetts, which is hopefully, if you follow the Right to Read Act, going to help districts to focus more on giving this type of instruction. That is a component of it. The other component of it is, I will say it's my personal soapbox, you're not trained to teach this way in a teacher preparation program. I have multiple degrees in education, and I know how to teach this way because I had the good fortune to come to Carroll School in 2005. And I really think you can learn it on paper, but to learn it in an environment is a whole different piece. So unfortunately, the teacher prep programs have a way to go, but I really have hope that we're on the road in Massachusetts. I mean, I know that might not feel that way in your district, but I do think it works for so many kids, um, whether they have dyslexia or they do not. And what a wonderful thing that we are at a point in time where we can use this research and our own voices to advocate for all kids.
I agree. I agree. And we're so grateful to have you here, Heather, training our teachers and training teachers both internally and externally and moving forward this initiative to get as many people trained in this approach as possible. And so thank you for your time today and sharing with our Summer at Carroll parent audience about Orton-Gillingham. If anyone has any questions, as Heather said, follow up at summer@carrollschool.org and we'll get back to you. And Heather is happy to talk more at any time about this topic. It's a near and dear to her heart.
I said to Amy, it's my preferred topic of conversation, so I am. But I thank all of you for coming today, and I also thank you for sending your kids to us. We really, really appreciate it. Carroll's a special place, and that is the teachers, that is the parents, that is the kids, that is the staff. So thank you.